The strange thing about a movie called 180 is that the title already sounds unfinished before the trailer even begins. It feels incomplete, like somebody stopped mid-sentence. And honestly, that feeling becomes incredibly important once you actually sit with the footage. Because this is one of those trailers that clearly wants the audience to feel unstable before they understand why. Not confused in a cheap mystery box way, where filmmakers throw random imagery at you and hope people online create theories for free marketing. This feels more deliberate than that. The trailer behaves almost like a psychological interruption. It cuts into scenes before emotions can settle. It keeps shifting tone at moments where most Hollywood editors would normally allow a scene to breathe. And the first time I watched it, I remember thinking, this movie is either going to completely collapse under its own ambition, or it's going to become one of those deeply unsettling dramas people rediscover years later and wonder why nobody talked about it enough when it released. And right away, the atmosphere tells you this is not trying to be a conventional thriller. The opening frames are too quiet for that. There's this washed out urban lighting, almost gray-blue in tone, where the city itself feels emotionally exhausted. Not futuristic, not dystopian, just tired. Like the kind of modern American city where people are constantly surrounded by noise, yet emotionally isolated from each other. You can feel the influence of late 2000s psychological cinema all over the visual language. The camera lingers on faces slightly longer than comfortable. Reflections in windows matter. Empty hallways matter. Even the pauses between dialogue exchanges feel intentional. And then you see the central character for the first real time, not introduced like a superhero, not introduced like an action lead. He looks damaged before he even speaks. There's something heavy sitting behind his eyes, and the trailer wisely avoids over-explaining him. Modern trailers usually make the mistake of telling audiences everything immediately because studios are terrified people will lose interest within 20 seconds. But this trailer trusts silence more than exposition, which honestly feels refreshing now. The lead performance immediately carries this restrained emotional pressure. You can tell the actor understood the assignment wasn't about looking cool. It was about looking haunted without becoming theatrical. That's a difficult balance because psychologically broken characters in Hollywood often drift into parody. Either the actor goes too intense too early, or the writing romanticizes suffering until it stops feeling human. Here, the trailer suggests somebody who has been emotionally imploding for a very long time and has become frighteningly good at hiding it in public. What fascinated me most is how the trailer structures memory. There are repeated visual fragments that don't fully connect the first time you see them. A woman standing near a subway platform, a hand covered in blood that may or may not belong to the protagonist, a child's voice in the distance, rain hitting a windshield while somebody breathes heavily off camera. These aren't random aesthetic shots. The editing pattern suggests fractured recollection. The movie seems deeply interested in perspective and unreliable emotional truth. And you can feel that the filmmakers studied older psychological dramas instead of modern algorithm-driven streaming content. There's patience in the construction. Some shots remain on screen just long enough to create discomfort. The trailer doesn't rush toward spectacle. It slowly tightens around the audience. Honestly, that's harder to pull off than giant explosions or loud orchestral drops. There's one particular moment in the trailer that stayed with me longer than I expected. The protagonist is standing in what looks like a nearly empty apartment, and somebody off-screen asks him a question we never fully hear because the soundtrack partially drowns it out. But the expression on his face changes instantly, not dramatically, barely at all actually, just enough for you to realize the character is carrying guilt so deep it has altered the way he processes reality. That tiny acting detail told me more about the film than any exposition dump could, and then the score begins shifting. not into traditional thriller music. It becomes more rhythmic, almost mechanical, like a heartbeat trying to regulate itself during panic. The sound design is actually one of the smartest parts of the trailer, because it avoids manipulative emotional shortcuts. There's no giant bee-wah trailer noise every 5 seconds. No desperate attempt to manufacture fake intensity. Instead, the audio slowly builds internal pressure. You feel tension accumulating underneath ordinary scenes. There's also a recurring visual motif involving mirrors and reflections. Usually when movies do this, it becomes embarrassingly obvious. We get it. The character has duality. But here the reflections feel fragmented instead of symbolic in a simplistic way. Sometimes the protagonist avoids looking directly at himself. Sometimes the camera frames him through distorted glass, where parts of his face disappear. It creates the impression that the film is less interested in plot twists and more interested in identity erosion. One thing I genuinely appreciated is that the trailer refuses to define the movie too narrowly. For a while, you think it might become a crime story. Then suddenly it feels like a psychological character study. Then there are flashes suggesting moral ambiguity, possible paranoia, maybe even themes involving redemption or self-destruction. The trailer keeps shifting genre textures without losing emotional consistency. That's difficult editing work. And honestly, modern audiences sometimes forget how important trailers used to be as standalone pieces of filmmaking. Back before every plot leak existed online 6 months early, trailers created emotional curiosity rather than informational summaries. This feels crafted in that older style. It wants you to wonder. It wants conversations afterward. It assumes viewers are intelligent enough to connect emotional dots themselves. There's another fascinating layer underneath all this too, and that's the way the trailer frames masculinity. The protagonist doesn't behave like the polished, emotionally unavailable anti-heroes Hollywood mass-produced for years. He looks vulnerable in ugly ways, exhausted, ashamed, angry at himself more than other people. There's a scene where he punches a wall, but even that moment isn't filmed triumphantly. It looks pathetic, painful, self-destructive. The movie seems aware that unresolved trauma often manifests outwardly in ways men don't know how to articulate, and the supporting cast appears carefully chosen around that energy. Nobody feels overly glamorous. The people surrounding the protagonist look grounded. Real faces, real exhaustion, real emotional wear. One woman in particular, who seems emotionally connected to the lead in some complicated way, has this incredible stillness in her scenes. She barely raises her voice in the trailer, yet she commands attention every time she appears. Those kinds of performances usually indicate strong directing, because subtle actors need directors who trust restraint. The cinematography also deserves attention, because there's a texture to the lighting that reminds me of early Denis Villeneuve work, mixed with grounded American indie dramas from the late 2000s. Night scenes are dim, without becoming visually incomprehensible. Daylight scenes feel emotionally cold rather than warm. Interiors have this claustrophobic composition where ceilings feel lower than normal, making characters appear trapped even in ordinary rooms. And then halfway through the trailer, the pacing changes entirely. The cuts become faster. Dialogue fragments overlap. A police siren appears briefly. Someone screams off camera. There's a shot of the protagonist running. But even that doesn't feel action-oriented. It feels desperate, like escape instead of pursuit. And the trailer smartly avoids revealing exactly what he's running from. That restraint matters, because mystery only works when filmmakers understand the difference between intrigue and vagueness. One line in the trailer especially caught my attention because it sounds simple at first, but the way it's delivered completely changes its meaning. Somebody tells the protagonist, "You already crossed the line." And the actor reacts like the line wasn't crossed once. It's been crossed repeatedly for years. That single moment implies the movie may revolve around accumulated moral compromise rather than one catastrophic event. That's where the title starts becoming more interesting too. 180, not 360, not full transformation, just reversal, partial change, turning around before completion. The title suggests interruption, maybe redemption that comes too late, maybe somebody trying to reverse damage already done. The number itself starts feeling psychologically loaded once the trailer contextualizes it emotionally. And honestly, I miss movies willing to trust audiences with darker emotional ambiguity like this. Everything now gets flattened into hero and villain branding because studios want international simplicity, but human beings don't actually function that way. The trailer for this film understands moral confusion. It understands regret. It understands the terrifying realization that sometimes people become strangers to themselves gradually instead of suddenly. Even visually, the movie appears obsessed with transitional spaces, elevators, parking garages, train stations, hallways, bridges, rarely places where people settle comfortably, mostly places people move through temporarily. That's not accidental. It reflects the protagonist's emotional condition. He exists between identities, between choices, between versions of himself. And the final minute of the trailer is where things become genuinely compelling. Because instead of escalating toward spectacle, the energy becomes quieter again. The music thins out. The cuts slow down. The protagonist finally looks directly into camera during a moment that doesn't technically break the fourth wall, but feels emotionally invasive anyway. And there's this expression on his face that communicates exhaustion beyond physical tiredness. The exhaustion of somebody who knows they've become capable of things they once judged in other people. Then we get rapid flashes. A gun. A hospital corridor. A woman crying silently in a bathroom. Water flooding across a floor. A car crash shown for maybe half a second. And finally, silence. Just silence. Then the title appears. No giant orchestral ending. No loud tagline. No desperate attempt to manufacture applause moments for social media reactions. Just the title sitting there, almost uncomfortably plain. And honestly, that confidence impressed me more than most blockbuster marketing campaigns I've seen recently, because the trailer understands something many modern movies forget. Human curiosity is stronger than overstimulation. If you create emotional tension honestly, people lean in naturally. You don't need to scream at them constantly. What really stayed with me afterward wasn't a single shocking moment. It was the emotional residue. That heavy feeling certain psychological dramas leave behind, where you keep replaying tiny moments in your head hours later. The look on the protagonist's face, the fragmented dialogue, the sense that everybody in the film is carrying invisible emotional damage they no longer know how to discuss openly. And when a trailer can create that kind of lingering emotional atmosphere without revealing its entire structure, that's usually a sign the filmmakers understand tone at a deeper level than most studio productions do today. The more I kept replaying the trailer for 180, the more I started noticing something that honestly separates memorable psychological cinema from disposable streaming thrillers that vanish from public memory 2 weeks after release. This trailer understands emotional geography. That sounds like a strange phrase at first, but certain filmmakers know how to build spaces that reflect the mental condition of their characters. You're not just watching locations. You're feeling internal states projected outward through architecture, lighting, and movement. There's a sequence buried in the middle section of the trailer where the protagonist walks through what looks like an underground transit tunnel, and the camera follows several feet behind him instead of beside him. That choice matters. Most modern trailers stay aggressively close to actors because studios are terrified audiences will lose attention if they're not staring directly into somebody's face every second. But this scene creates distance intentionally. It makes the character feel isolated, even before dialogue confirms anything emotionally. The tunnel itself looks endless. The fluorescent lights flicker slightly. His footsteps echo harder than they should. And suddenly, the environment starts feeling emotionally oppressive. That's directing with psychological intention instead of pure aesthetics. And I think people underestimate how difficult that actually is. Anybody can shoot a dark scene now. Digital cameras made mood lighting accessible to everybody. But emotional atmosphere, real atmosphere, that comes from understanding how viewers subconsciously process visual rhythm. This trailer repeatedly uses emptiness in fascinating ways. Empty streets, empty rooms, empty space beside characters during conversations. It creates this lingering sense that the protagonist is emotionally disconnected from the world around him long before the plot fully explains why. There's also an interesting tension between realism and stylization happening throughout the footage. The performances feel grounded, almost documentary-like at moments, but the editing occasionally slips into fragmented, subjective imagery. Quick flashes, distorted sound, unclear chronology. It gives the impression that the audience may eventually experience events through the protagonist's damaged perception rather than objective reality. And honestly, if that's the route the film takes, it immediately becomes more interesting than most mainstream thrillers. Because unreliable narration only works when filmmakers respect emotional truth. Too many movies use psychological instability as a gimmick for twist endings. But the trailer for this film doesn't feel interested in tricking viewers. It feels interested in emotional deterioration. That's a huge difference. One of the strongest things here is how human everybody looks. I know that sounds obvious, but think about modern Hollywood for a second. So many films now cast people who appear manufactured for social media screenshots rather than believable emotional existence. Everybody's lit perfectly, styled perfectly. Even emotionally devastated characters somehow look fashion ready. Here, people look exhausted. Their eyes look tired. Conversations happen in dim kitchens and cramped apartments instead of glossy cinematic fantasy environments. There's a dinner table scene in the trailer that lasts maybe 4 seconds total, but it tells you so much about the emotional DNA of the movie. Nobody at the table is screaming. Nobody's delivering dramatic monologues. Yet the silence between the characters feels unbearable. One person tries avoiding eye contact. Somebody else stares at their food too long. The protagonist looks physically present, but emotionally miles away from everybody else. And suddenly you understand this film probably isn't about one catastrophic moment alone. It's about long-term emotional corrosion. That kind of storytelling usually ages better because it's rooted in recognizable human behavior. And I'll be honest, there's something deeply uncomfortable about the trailer's treatment of guilt. Most movies externalize guilt into obvious punishment. Police chases, violence, public consequences. But this trailer keeps implying that the protagonist's worst punishment might actually be continued existence inside his own mind. There's a shot where he's sitting alone in a parked car at night, breathing heavily while traffic lights change across his face, and nothing happens in the traditional cinematic sense. Yet emotionally, it feels devastating. You can see somebody trying unsuccessfully to outrun themselves. That's powerful material if handled correctly. The trailer also avoids one of the biggest mistakes modern psychological dramas make: over-explaining trauma. There are hints of past events everywhere, but the editing never pauses to spoon-feed emotional interpretation. You're allowed to observe behavior and draw conclusions gradually. That restraint creates maturity. And weirdly enough, the trailer becomes more emotionally compelling the quieter it gets. Usually trailers panic halfway through and start throwing spectacle everywhere because they think attention spans are collapsing. Here, the filmmakers seem strangely confident in stillness. There are entire stretches where dialogue almost disappears and the camera simply watches people exist uncomfortably inside silence. That's not easy to market. Silence scares studios, but silence can also create intimacy when used correctly. The sound design deserves serious credit too, because it avoids manipulative excess almost entirely. Notice how often ambient noise replaces traditional music cues. Air conditioning hums, train brakes screech, rain taps against windows, distant traffic bleeds into conversations. Those sounds create realism, but they also trap viewers inside the protagonist's psychological environment. The world never fully quiets down around him. There's always pressure somewhere in the background. And then there's the question of morality. The trailer carefully suggests the protagonist may not deserve audience sympathy in the conventional sense. That's fascinating because Hollywood usually sanitizes damaged male leads into misunderstood victims. This feels harsher than that. There are glimpses suggesting he's hurt people emotionally, maybe physically, maybe permanently. Yet the trailer also frames him with enough vulnerability that you can't dismiss him entirely as monstrous either. That gray area is where the most memorable dramas usually live. Life rarely gives us perfectly clean emotional categories. People destroy things while genuinely hating themselves for it. People seek redemption while still causing collateral damage. The trailer appears deeply aware of that contradiction. There's one incredibly brief shot, maybe less than 2 seconds, where the protagonist is standing outside a hospital room window, and whoever is inside the room is never shown clearly. But the way he freezes there tells you everything. The body language alone communicates history, regret, fear, and helplessness simultaneously. Good actors understand that emotional realism often happens in what characters fail to say rather than what they announce dramatically. I also noticed how carefully the trailer uses color. Early scenes lean heavily into cold grays and washed blues, but later flashes introduce warmer tones very selectively. Not enough to feel comforting. More like memories of emotional warmth rather than actual safety. Certain scenes involving the female lead use softer lighting, almost suggesting she represents some lost version of emotional honesty the protagonist can't fully reconnect with anymore. And speaking of her, the trailer smartly avoids reducing her into a simplistic love interest. That's another thing I appreciated immediately. She doesn't appear framed as the magical emotional cure for a broken man. In fact, some of the most emotionally tense moments in the trailer involve her recognizing aspects of the protagonist he's desperately trying to conceal. Her expressions carry disappointment more than romantic longing. That makes the relationship instantly more believable. There's also a subtle class realism throughout the footage that grounds everything further. Nobody seems wealthy in the glamorous Hollywood sense. Apartments feel lived in instead of production designed for magazine spreads. Clothing looks practical. Cars look ordinary. Even the bars and restaurants shown briefly feel like actual places people would wander into after emotionally exhausting workdays. That realism matters, because psychological collapse becomes more frightening when it happens inside recognizable ordinary life. The trailer never creates the safe distance of fantasy. These people feel like individuals you could genuinely encounter. And honestly, I think that's why the trailer lingers emotionally after it ends. Not because of plot mystery alone, because it feels emotionally plausible. The fear underneath the film isn't monsters or conspiracies or giant world-ending stakes. It's the possibility that unresolved emotional damage slowly transforms people until they barely recognize themselves anymore. There's another remarkable editing decision near the end of the trailer, where two separate conversations overlap in audio, while unrelated visuals play underneath. Usually that technique feels pretentious when directors overuse it. Here, it works, because both conversations seem emotionally connected, even if they occur at different times. One voice talks about consequences, while another asks whether people can actually change. Meanwhile, the visuals show the protagonist alone in multiple locations, reinforcing the idea that he's psychologically fragmented between past and present versions of himself. And then the trailer starts subtly accelerating again. Not loudly, not explosively, just emotionally. You feel pressure building under the surface. The protagonist begins looking increasingly unstable. Other characters appear more frightened around him. There are hints of violence, but interestingly, the trailer never fetishizes it. Every violent image looks ugly and sudden rather than entertaining. Even the action scenes, if you can call them that, feel rooted in panic instead of cinematic coolness. That's another sign of maturity. The filmmakers appear more interested in emotional aftermath than spectacle itself. One sequence especially stood out to me because of how restrained it was. The protagonist sits across from another man in what appears to be either a therapist's office or some kind of legal consultation room. The other man asks a question quietly. We never hear the full sentence. The protagonist almost answers, then stops. And the camera stays there. No dramatic score, no clever dialogue. Just silence stretching painfully between two people. That moment told me the movie likely understands something essential about guilt. Sometimes the hardest thing isn't punishment, it's articulation. It's forcing yourself to say certain truths out loud after spending years constructing emotional defenses against them. And honestly, if the full film maintains even half the emotional intelligence suggested by the trailer, it's probably going to resonate deeply with audiences tired of psychologically shallow storytelling disguised as dark cinema. Because darkness alone means nothing. Anybody can make things grim. What matters is emotional honesty. And this trailer feels painfully honest about the way people carry damage through modern life while pretending functionality on the surface. That's why even its quieter moments feel tense. Everybody on screen looks like they're one difficult conversation away from emotional collapse. The final images become almost dreamlike without fully abandoning realism. Reflections blur. Streetlights smear across wet pavement. The protagonist appears physically present but mentally elsewhere. There's a recurring sensation throughout the trailer that time itself feels unstable to him. Not in a science fiction sense, in a trauma sense. Past experiences seem to bleed continuously into present reality. Then there's one final shot I can't stop thinking about. He's standing completely still while chaos unfolds somewhere behind him out of focus. People are shouting. Something catastrophic may have happened. But he doesn't react immediately. He just stands there with this terrifying emptiness on his face, like somebody who has emotionally burned through every remaining defense mechanism. And right before the screen cuts to black, you realize the trailer has been asking one uncomfortable question the entire time without directly saying it. Can a person truly reverse themselves after crossing certain moral lines? Or do they simply learn how to survive living with what they became? By the time the trailer reaches its final emotional stretch, something really interesting starts happening underneath the surface tension. You stop trying to predict the plot and start studying behavior instead. That's usually the sign of a psychologically mature film. The mystery becomes secondary to the emotional condition of the people trapped inside it. And honestly, that's a harder thing to sustain because audiences can forgive a familiar story if the human behavior feels painfully real. What they don't forgive is emotional dishonesty. And this trailer keeps circling emotional dishonesty constantly. Not just lies between characters, internal dishonesty, the kind people construct to survive themselves. There's a brief sequence where the protagonist appears to revisit a location connected to his past, maybe a childhood home, maybe somewhere tied to a traumatic memory, and the camera suddenly becomes handheld in a much more unstable way than earlier scenes. It's subtle, but the entire visual language shifts. The frame struggles to stay centered. Focus softens momentarily. Background audio becomes distorted. It creates the sensation that the character's mental stability is beginning to fracture simply by confronting physical spaces attached to memory. That's smart filmmaking because trauma is rarely linear. People think healing works logically, like checking emotional boxes in order. Real trauma behaves more like ambush, a hallway, a smell, a sound. A room you haven't entered in years suddenly collapses the distance between past and present. The trailer understands that, and I think that's why it feels emotionally heavier than most mainstream thrillers, pretending to be deep. This doesn't feel like a movie using psychological themes for decoration. It feels like a film genuinely interested in the exhausting mechanics of guilt and emotional survival. One thing I noticed after multiple rewatches is how rarely the protagonist actually relaxes on screen. Even in quieter scenes, his body language stays defensive. Shoulders tense, eyes constantly scanning, hands restless. He behaves like somebody waiting for impact before impact even arrives. That level of physical acting usually indicates strong direction because actors often default to obvious emotional expression unless guided towards subtler behavioral patterns. There's also a fascinating absence of sentimental manipulation. The trailer never begs the audience to pity him. That's important, because forced sympathy kills complexity. Here, the filmmakers seem willing to let viewers feel conflicted. Sometimes the protagonist appears deeply wounded. Other moments, he genuinely feels dangerous, and not dangerous in a glamorous cinematic anti-hero way. Dangerous in the unpredictable emotional sense, where damaged people become capable of hurting others simply because they've stopped valuing themselves properly. That emotional unpredictability gives the trailer its tension. You're never fully certain whether you're watching somebody approaching redemption or collapse. And honestly, the best psychological dramas usually live inside that uncertainty. There's another visual detail I appreciated that most viewers probably won't consciously notice during a first watch. The movie repeatedly frames characters through barriers, doorways, windows, rear-view mirrors, partially obstructed angles. Very rarely do conversations occur in fully open compositions. It subconsciously reinforces the idea that every relationship in the film contains emotional separation. Nobody fully reaches each other. Even intimacy feels distant. One scene especially stayed with me. The protagonist and the female lead sit beside each other in near silence while television light flickers across the room. They aren't fighting. They aren't embracing. They just exist beside one another, carrying visible emotional fatigue. And somehow that felt more heartbreaking than dramatic screaming ever could. Because adult emotional damage often looks exactly like that. Not explosions, exhaustion, people slowly running out of language for what they feel. The trailer also seems deeply aware of loneliness inside crowded environments. There are multiple shots where the protagonist moves through busy public spaces while feeling completely detached from everyone around him. Restaurants filled with noise, train stations packed with commuters, traffic intersections overflowing with movement. Yet the sound mix subtly isolates him from the environment, almost like he's emotionally underwater while life continues normally around him. That feeling is disturbingly relatable in modern urban life, and it gives the trailer this strange emotional realism that lingers afterward. Another thing I genuinely respected. The movie doesn't appear interested in easy morality. There's no obvious villain figure dominating the footage. Even authority figures shown briefly. Police officers, investigators, therapists, whoever they may be, don't seem framed as simplistic oppositional forces. Everybody looks tired. Everybody looks morally compromised in smaller ways. The world itself feels emotionally eroded. That's a much more adult worldview than standard Hollywood morality structures. And it reminds me of the era when studios occasionally financed mid-budget psychological dramas aimed at emotionally mature audiences instead of exclusively chasing franchise universes and nostalgia extraction campaigns. You can also feel traces of older American cinema influences here. There's a little bit of Taxi Driver in the alienation, a little bit of Michael Clayton in the exhausted moral atmosphere, even shades of Memento in the fragmented psychological framing, though this feels less structurally gimmicky and more emotionally grounded. But the trailer never feels derivative. It feels inspired without becoming imitation. That's a difficult balance. And then there's the pacing. God, the pacing is confident. Modern trailers are terrified of stillness because executives think viewers must receive constant stimulation every 3 seconds, or they'll open another app. This trailer rejects that rhythm completely. It allows discomfort to exist on screen. It allows pauses after emotionally significant dialogue. It trusts atmosphere instead of informational overload. That confidence alone makes the film stand out immediately. There's a sequence near the end where the protagonist appears to confront somebody from his past in a parking structure at night. The scene is lit almost entirely by harsh overhead fluorescence. No cinematic blue tint. No romanticized noir lighting. Just ugly industrial brightness exposing every detail. And the confrontation itself doesn't look choreographed for entertainment. It looks messy, emotionally chaotic. Two people carrying years of unresolved resentment without the emotional tools to process it properly. That realism makes the tension sharper, because actual emotional confrontations rarely sound clever in real life. People stumble through them. They contradict themselves. They say cruel things they regret immediately. The trailer hints at exactly that kind of emotional messiness, and I think audiences are hungry for that again. Not perfection, not polished heroism, human contradiction. There's even something quietly devastating about the way the trailer handles physical space around the protagonist. Notice how often he's visually boxed in by the environment. Narrow corridors, small rooms, tight framing inside cars. Even outdoor scenes somehow feel claustrophobic. The world itself seems to press inward on him psychologically. That creates a suffocating emotional atmosphere without needing excessive exposition. One of the strongest moments comes from almost nothing. The protagonist sits awake in darkness, while morning light slowly enters the room. No dialogue, no music, just silence and exhaustion. But the expression on his face suggests somebody who either hasn't slept properly in years or no longer experiences rest emotionally, even when asleep. That kind of imagery hits harder with age too. Younger audiences often connect more immediately to explosive trauma storytelling because it's external and visible. But older viewers recognize quieter psychological deterioration, the fatigue, the isolation, the inability to escape your own thought patterns. The trailer seems remarkably aware of that emotional reality. And honestly, the title keeps becoming more meaningful the longer you sit with the footage. 180. Not transformation into something new. Rotation, reversal, attempted correction, but incomplete correction. There's something tragic embedded in that number, because a 180-degree turn still leaves you on the same road. You're just facing the opposite direction now. The trailer subtly suggests the protagonist may understand what he became, but understanding damage and undoing damage are very different things. That's an emotionally mature idea. The film also appears refreshingly uninterested in fake inspirational messaging. Nobody in the trailer delivers grand speeches about hope or healing. Redemption, if it exists here at all, looks painful and uncertain. That's far more believable than the clean emotional resolutions many studio dramas force onto psychologically messy material. And then there's the final emotional hook. The trailer leaves buried under all the visual tension. Fear. Not fear of death. Fear of self-recognition. The protagonist increasingly looks like a man terrified of understanding himself completely. Every scene feels weighted by avoided truth. Even when he's alone, he behaves like somebody hiding from observation. That psychological contradiction creates enormous dramatic potential because it transforms ordinary scenes into emotional minefields. A simple conversation feels dangerous. A phone call feels dangerous. Silence feels dangerous. That's excellent tension construction. There's also a recurring motif involving water throughout the trailer that I found fascinating. Rainstorms, wet streets, running sinks, reflections across puddles. Water traditionally symbolizes cleansing in cinema, but here it never feels cleansing. It feels invasive, cold, suffocating, almost like memory itself, leaking uncontrollably into present reality. Again, subtle filmmaking choices like that usually indicate directors thinking emotionally rather than purely narratively. And the more I think about it, the more I appreciate how anti-modern this trailer actually feels in the best possible way. It isn't engineered for meme moments or reaction clips. It's built around emotional accumulation, mood, psychological residue, the kind of storytelling that stays with audiences because it taps into recognizable emotional fears rather than temporary spectacle. By the closing moments, the trailer almost stops functioning like marketing and starts feeling like emotional confession. The protagonist's face appears one final time, exhausted beyond anger now, beyond panic even, just emotionally stripped down to something raw and frighteningly human. And there's this sense that whatever happened in the story may ultimately matter less than what the experience has psychologically done to him. That's the final impression the trailer leaves behind. Not excitement, weight. The heavy realization that some people spend their entire lives trying desperately to rotate away from the worst version of themselves, while secretly fearing they already became it years ago. What really elevates the trailer beyond ordinary psychological drama territory is the way it quietly studies consequences instead of events. Most modern trailers are obsessed with incidents, the accident, the murder, the betrayal, the revelation. But this one seems much more interested in the emotional aftershocks that continue long after the original damage occurred. You can feel it in every frame. Nobody in this movie looks emotionally fresh. Everybody looks like they've been carrying invisible weight for years. And honestly, that may be the most realistic thing about it. Life-changing trauma rarely arrives with cinematic music and clean narrative structure. Most of the time, it lingers in smaller ways. It alters the rhythm of conversations, the way people enter rooms, the way somebody hesitates before answering ordinary questions. The trailer understands those behavioral details deeply. There's a moment I kept replaying because of how understated it is. The protagonist stands in a convenience store late at night under harsh fluorescent lighting, while the cashier speaks to him casually about something completely insignificant. Weather maybe, time maybe, The dialogue itself barely matters. What matters is the protagonist's inability to fully participate in normal interaction anymore. He responds half a second too late every time. His eyes drift constantly. He looks physically present, but emotionally disconnected from basic human routine. That's not dramatic acting in the traditional sense. That's observational acting, the kind rooted in studying real emotional isolation, and it gives the trailer a haunting authenticity. The film also seems deeply aware of modern emotional numbness. There's this recurring sensation that the protagonist has experienced something so psychologically overwhelming that ordinary life now feels unreal to him. Crowded spaces don't stimulate him properly. Conversations sound distant. Even moments that should provoke visible emotion seem to hit him through layers of internal detachment first. That psychological state is incredibly difficult to portray on screen without becoming exaggerated, but the trailer handles it with impressive restraint. One thing that genuinely surprised me was how mature the editing feels emotionally, not technically flashy, emotionally intelligent. There's a huge difference. A lot of contemporary trailers mistake chaos for intensity. Rapid cuts, deafening soundtracks, constant screaming. But real emotional intensity often comes from contrast, silence beside panic, stillness beside violence, calm surfaces hiding internal collapse. This trailer understands contrast beautifully. There's one section where soft piano music enters very briefly while the protagonist drives through the city at night, and for a few seconds, the film almost feels reflective instead of threatening. You start wondering whether redemption might actually be possible for him. Then the music cuts out abruptly the moment he notices something outside the car window. We never see clearly what he saw, but his expression changes instantly. Fear mixed with recognition. And suddenly you realize the movie may not allow escape that easily. That emotional uncertainty keeps the trailer gripping because it refuses to promise catharsis. I also appreciate how grounded the violence appears to be. Every violent glimpse in the trailer feels abrupt and ugly rather than choreographed for entertainment value. There's no fetishistic slow motion, no triumphant framing. Even physical confrontations look emotionally miserable instead of exciting. That choice matters because it reinforces the film's overall worldview. Damage spreads outward. Nobody wins emotionally from it. The trailer's treatment of memory is fascinating too, because it never clearly distinguishes between objective flashbacks and psychological intrusion. Some images may be literal recollections. Others may be guilt manifesting emotionally rather than factually. The film seems interested in how memory mutates under emotional pressure. And honestly, that's true to real life. People don't remember trauma cleanly. Emotions reshape perception over time. Certain details become exaggerated. Others disappear completely. The trailer captures that instability through fragmented imagery and overlapping audio without becoming incomprehensible. There's also a subtle generational sadness underneath the footage that I think older audiences especially will recognize. This feels like a story about people who spent years suppressing emotional damage because they were never taught how to process it properly. Nobody in the trailer talks openly about vulnerability. Emotions emerge sideways through anger, withdrawal, addiction, silence, recklessness. That's painfully believable, particularly for male characters raised inside environments where emotional articulation was often treated like weakness. The protagonist doesn't look like somebody seeking healing. He looks like somebody barely surviving himself. And the supporting characters seem exhausted from trying to reach him emotionally. One woman, possibly an ex-partner, maybe a wife, maybe someone connected to his past in another way, has this look throughout the trailer that's devastating precisely because it isn't dramatic. She doesn't appear shocked by his instability anymore. She appears tired of it, like somebody who has spent years hoping another person would eventually choose emotional honesty and slowly lost faith that it would ever happen. That emotional realism hits harder than melodrama ever could, because long-term emotional damage affects entire relational ecosystems. Families adapt around instability. Partners learn defensive patterns. Silence becomes routine. The trailer quietly suggests all of that without spelling it out directly. The cinematography reinforces those themes constantly. Characters are often framed separately, even when occupying the same room. Conversations happen with physical barriers between people. Reflections divide faces. Shadows interrupt compositions. Visually, the movie keeps insisting that connection itself has become fractured. And then there's the city. God. The city in this trailer feels emotionally alive. Not glamorous, not cinematic in the postcard sense. Alive in the exhausted urban way where millions of people exist physically close together while remaining emotionally isolated from each other. Wet sidewalks, flickering signs, empty trains, parking structures at midnight, anonymous apartment buildings. The setting itself becomes part of the protagonist's psychology. That's something great urban dramas understand instinctively. Cities amplify emotional loneliness because they surround people with constant evidence of other lives continuing without them. The trailer uses that beautifully. Another thing I noticed is how carefully the filmmakers avoid over-defining the protagonist's past. We receive fragments, suggestions, emotional evidence, but never complete explanatory monologues. That restraint preserves complexity. Once movies over-explain trauma, characters often stop feeling human and start feeling clinically diagnosed for audience convenience. This trailer avoids that trap completely. It trusts viewers to interpret behavior. And honestly, audiences are smarter than studios often assume. People recognize pain without needing every detail explained explicitly. There's a particularly strong scene where the protagonist seems moments away from confessing something important to another character. The camera stays close enough to catch every hesitation in his breathing. He starts speaking, stops, tries again, then changes the subject entirely. Nothing technically happens in the scene, yet emotionally it feels massive, because you can sense years of repression colliding against the fear of exposure. That's where the trailer becomes genuinely compelling to me. Not in its mystery, in its emotional cowardice. Because the film appears brutally honest about how people avoid truth, even while desperately wanting freedom from it. That contradiction drives so much real human suffering, and it's rarely portrayed this carefully in mainstream cinema. The soundtrack also deserves more credit than it'll probably receive. Notice how often music disappears entirely during emotionally critical moments. Many filmmakers fear silence because silence forces viewers into uncomfortable intimacy with characters. But this trailer repeatedly removes musical guidance right when emotions become most vulnerable. That creates authenticity. Without a score telling you what to feel, you start observing behavior more closely. Facial tension, vocal hesitation, physical discomfort. The performances carry emotional weight naturally instead of relying on manipulation. And speaking of performances, the lead actor appears completely committed to emotional realism over vanity. That's increasingly rare in psychologically dark roles. A lot of actors still protect their image subconsciously, even while portraying damaged characters. They want audiences to understand they're troubled, but attractively troubled. This performance looks uglier than that. More exposed, less controlled. His exhaustion feels lived in, not performed. That distinction matters enormously. There's also something quietly tragic about the trailer's recurring emphasis on routine. The protagonist continues doing ordinary things despite obvious psychological collapse. Driving, eating, showering, working, existing mechanically inside daily life. The film seems deeply aware that most emotional breakdowns don't happen dramatically in public. People often continue functioning externally while deteriorating internally for years. That idea gives the trailer enormous emotional weight because viewers recognize it, maybe in themselves, maybe in people they know, maybe in relationships they lost without fully understanding why. And the closer the trailer moves toward its conclusion, the more the emotional tension shifts from what happened to can this person still emotionally return from wherever he disappeared inside himself? That's a much stronger question, a more painful one too, because some forms of damage aren't solved by revelation alone. Awareness doesn't automatically restore humanity. The title keeps echoing through all of this in such an interesting way. 180 starts feeling less like a plot device and more like an emotional challenge. Can somebody truly turn themselves around after years of denial? After crossing ethical boundaries repeatedly? After allowing guilt to calcify into identity? The trailer never gives easy answers. And that's exactly why it works. By the final images, the protagonist almost looks emotionally translucent, stripped of performance, stripped of excuses, just a human being confronting the terrifying possibility that he may already be too late to become the person he once imagined himself capable of being. Then the screen cuts to black, so quietly, it barely feels like an ending, more like emotional suspension. Like the movie isn't asking audiences whether the protagonist survives physically. It's asking whether survival means anything if somebody no longer recognizes the soul they're surviving with. And sitting with that final feeling for a while, what becomes increasingly clear is that the trailer for 180 isn't really structured around suspense in the traditional Hollywood sense at all. It's structured around emotional inevitability. Every frame carries this lingering sensation that the protagonist has already crossed certain lines internally, and now the entire story revolves around whether acknowledgement arrives before destruction does. That creates a completely different type of tension. You're not waiting for a twist. You're waiting for emotional collision. And honestly, those are the films that usually stay with people longest. There's something deeply mature about stories that understand how human beings slowly drift into moral compromise instead of instantly transforming into monsters overnight. The trailer keeps hinting that the protagonist didn't wake up one morning evil or broken. He became disconnected gradually, through avoidance, through denial, through repeated small decisions that accumulated over time until he could no longer emotionally separate himself from the damage he caused. That's frightening, because it feels real. Life-changing collapse rarely announces itself dramatically in the beginning. Most people recognize it only in retrospect. The trailer captures that idea constantly through visual repetition. Certain locations keep returning. Certain expressions repeat under different circumstances. Certain fragments of dialogue echo in altered emotional contexts. It creates the sensation of a man psychologically circling unresolved truth while pretending forward movement. And I think that's why the title becomes almost devastating once you absorb the emotional subtext fully. A 180-degree turn sounds significant on paper, but emotionally, sometimes turning around still means carrying everything behind you forward. The trailer understands that reversal alone doesn't erase consequence. There's one especially remarkable moment involving silence inside a crowded diner scene. The protagonist sits across from another character while conversations blur indistinctly around them. Plates clatter, coffee pours, waitresses move between tables. Life continues normally in the background. Yet emotionally, the scene feels suffocating, because neither person seems capable of saying the thing both clearly understand already. That's real emotional paralysis, not cinematic paralysis, human paralysis. And the acting choices there are incredibly restrained. Nobody raises their voice. Nobody delivers dramatic speeches. The tension exists almost entirely through avoidance. Eye contact breaks too quickly. Sentences stop halfway. Hands remain still too long. Those tiny behavioral details create authenticity far more effectively than melodrama ever could. Another thing the trailer does brilliantly is refusing to isolate psychological damage into one big trauma explanation. Modern storytelling often reduces human behavior into simplistic origin points. One event defines everything. But this film appears more interested in accumulated erosion, years of emotional compromise, long-term self-deception, lingering guilt mutating into identity itself. That's psychologically richer territory. And honestly, much sadder. Because single events can sometimes feel solvable. But gradual self-destruction, that becomes terrifying precisely because people often don't realize how far they've emotionally drifted until relationships, morality, and self-recognition have already started collapsing around them. The trailer keeps returning to mirrors too, but not in the cliche, symbolic way audiences are used to. These reflections don't feel artistic for the sake of looking deep. They feel invasive, unwanted. The protagonist often appears startled by his own reflection, almost like he's catching accidental glimpses of himself rather than intentionally confronting identity. That's such a subtle but important distinction. It suggests somebody avoiding internal examination for a very long time. And the film's visual language consistently reinforces emotional fragmentation. Characters frequently enter scenes already mid-conversation or emotionally disconnected before dialogue even begins. The audience rarely experiences clean emotional transitions. Instead, scenes feel interrupted, unfinished, emotionally bruised before we arrive. That creates realism, because real emotional lives don't organize themselves neatly for narrative convenience. One sequence I couldn't stop thinking about involves rain pouring outside a motel window, while the protagonist sits awake alone under dim yellow lighting. Nothing overtly dramatic happens, but the atmosphere communicates absolute emotional exhaustion. He doesn't look like somebody planning. He looks like somebody running out of internal space to hide from himself. And that's the trailer's greatest strength overall. It understands emotional exhaustion as cinematic tension, not just fear, not just danger. Exhaustion. The fatigue of carrying unresolved guilt year after year until ordinary life itself starts feeling unbearable. That emotional realism gives the film weight beyond standard thriller mechanics. There's also a fascinating ambiguity surrounding whether redemption is even emotionally possible here. Most Hollywood narratives eventually reassure audiences that self-awareness leads naturally toward healing. This trailer never promises that. In fact, some moments imply the protagonist's growing self-awareness may actually be psychologically destroying him because it forces confrontation with truths he spent years suppressing. That's brutally honest. Sometimes recognition arrives too late to prevent damage. Sometimes understanding yourself more clearly hurts worse before anything remotely resembling healing becomes possible. The trailer doesn't soften that reality, and I respect it enormously for that. The supporting performances appear equally grounded in emotional realism. Nobody behaves like a narrative device existing solely to guide the protagonist toward transformation. Other characters carry their own visible histories, frustrations, emotional scars. Even brief reaction shots suggest entire relationships worth of unresolved tension. There's a scene where an older male character, maybe family maybe mentor, maybe former friend, looks at the protagonist with this complicated mixture of anger and disappointment that feels incredibly authentic. Not explosive rage. Worse than that, familiar disappointment. The kind that develops after years of watching somebody repeatedly refuse emotional accountability. That look alone tells an entire history without exposition. Great films trust faces. This trailer clearly does. And the urban environment keeps reinforcing alienation in subtle ways. The city never sleeps romantically here. It just continues existing indifferently. Neon lights flicker against wet pavement. Sirens echo distantly. Elevators hum. Traffic crawls endlessly through intersections. The protagonist moves through all of it like a ghost already emotionally disconnected from ordinary human rhythm. That atmosphere reminds me of the best grounded American psychological dramas from the late 90s and early 2000s, before everything became excessively stylized for franchise aesthetics. Back when adult dramas were allowed to feel emotionally ugly. Back when studios occasionally trusted audiences with unresolved moral discomfort. The trailer also uses physical proximity brilliantly. Characters stand close together constantly while feeling emotionally worlds apart. Intimate spaces become emotionally hostile because unresolved truth hangs silently between people. The camera often frames faces near each other without creating warmth. Instead, closeness increases discomfort. That's sophisticated emotional directing, because real relational damage often manifests exactly that way. The inability to connect, even while physically present, beside someone who once mattered deeply. There's another small moment I loved, where the protagonist reaches towards somebody during an argument, then stops himself halfway. It lasts maybe 1 second, but that hesitation says everything. Part of him still wants connection. Another part clearly believes he no longer deserves it. That internal contradiction seems central to the entire film. And honestly, that's why the trailer feels emotionally adult compared to most mainstream psychological stories now. It recognizes that people can simultaneously desire redemption and sabotage it at every opportunity, because self-hatred distorts their understanding of what they're worthy of receiving. That's painfully human. The music during the final stretch becomes almost ghostly too. Not triumphant. Not tragic in a manipulative orchestral way. Just distant. Sparse piano notes mixed with ambient city noise. Like the soundtrack itself is emotionally exhausted alongside the protagonist. Even the pacing changes emotionally near the end. Scenes stop feeling driven by external plot momentum and start feeling pulled by internal psychological gravity instead. Every image seems weighted by consequence. Every silence feels loaded with avoided truth. And then the trailer gives one final devastating implication without fully stating it outright. The protagonist may not actually fear punishment anymore. He may fear clarity. Because clarity removes excuses. Clarity forces people to see themselves without emotional distortion. That possibility hangs over the final moments like emotional suffocation. There's one last image where he stares into darkness so long that the shot almost becomes uncomfortable. No movement, no dialogue. Just somebody confronting the unbearable silence that appears when distractions finally disappear. And maybe that's what the movie is ultimately exploring underneath all the thriller elements and fragmented memory structure. Not whether people can commit terrible mistakes. Of course they can. The real question is whether human beings can survive complete emotional recognition of who they became after years of running from themselves. That's a much scarier idea than violence. Because violence ends. Self-recognition doesn't. And the trailer understands that deeply enough to leave audiences unsettled long after the footage stops playing. What I keep coming back to, even hours after watching the trailer, is how deeply exhausted everyone in this world feels. Not physically exhausted in the action movie sense, where characters have bruises and blood on their faces after surviving explosions. Emotional exhaustion, the kind that settles into people slowly over years until even ordinary conversations begin feeling heavy. That atmosphere is incredibly difficult to fake convincingly. A lot of filmmakers confuse darkness with depth. They lower the lighting, add sad music, throw in trauma references, and assume the audience will automatically interpret the material as emotionally profound. But genuine emotional weight comes from behavioral truth, and the trailer for 180 feels built almost entirely on behavioral truth. You can see it in the smallest moments. A delayed response during conversation, a person sitting in silence after a question instead of immediately answering, the protagonist rubbing his hands together unconsciously while pretending he's calm, a character walking away before an argument fully finishes because they already know how it ends. Those details matter because they create lived-in emotional history. Nothing feels freshly written for the convenience of plot. It feels carried. And honestly, that's probably the strongest compliment I can give the trailer. It feels emotionally carried by the people inside it, like everybody on screen existed long before the audience arrived, and will continue emotionally deteriorating after the scene ends. There's a sequence involving an elevator that stayed stuck in my head longer than some entire modern blockbusters. It's incredibly simple. The protagonist enters the elevator alone late at night. The fluorescent light overhead flickers slightly. Security camera perspective for a brief second. No music. Just the mechanical hum of the elevator descending. And the expression on his face during those few seconds tells you more about his psychological condition than pages of exposition could. He looks trapped by stillness. That's important. A lot of damaged people survive by staying in motion constantly. Noise, distraction, work, conflict, stimulation, but quiet spaces force confrontation. The trailer repeatedly implies the protagonist fears silence because silence leaves him alone with memory, and the film's relationship with memory becomes increasingly fascinating the more you study the editing. Certain images return repeatedly, but never exactly the same way twice. Sometimes a memory appears sharp and cold, other times distorted and fragmented, sometimes emotionally charged, sometimes numb. It creates the sense that the protagonist himself no longer trusts his own recollection completely. That's psychologically accurate. Trauma doesn't archive itself neatly. Emotion reshapes memory constantly, and the trailer uses that instability not for cheap narrative tricks, but to immerse viewers inside the protagonist's deteriorating mental state. There's another thing I admired tremendously. Nobody in this movie appears emotionally articulate in a polished cinematic way. People struggle to express themselves. Conversations collapse awkwardly. Characters contradict their own feelings. They lash out at the wrong moments. They withdraw when honesty becomes possible. That's real. Human beings are messy communicators, especially when guilt and shame become involved. The trailer seems deeply aware of how emotionally inarticulate damaged people often become over time. Not because they feel nothing, but because certain truths become too dangerous internally to speak clearly. One of the most heartbreaking moments comes from almost no dialogue at all. The protagonist sits across from a woman who clearly once mattered enormously to him. Neither person appears angry anymore. That phase seems long gone. What remains is sadness. Familiar sadness. The sadness of two people who understand exactly where things broke, but no longer know whether repair is emotionally possible. And the way the scene is framed visually is brilliant. They're sitting at the same table, but the composition subtly separates them through depth and shadow. They occupy the same space physically, while feeling emotionally unreachable from each other. That's sophisticated visual storytelling. No forced symbolism, just emotional architecture. The trailer also understands something many psychological dramas completely miss. Guilt changes time perception. When people carry unresolved emotional damage, the past doesn't stay contained properly. It bleeds into present moments unpredictably. Ordinary environments trigger emotional flashbacks. Simple interactions reopen buried panic. The trailer constantly blurs those boundaries. There are moments where the protagonist looks like he's experiencing present reality and intrusive memory simultaneously, and the audience feels disoriented alongside him, not confused narratively, emotionally destabilized. That's much harder to achieve. Another fascinating layer is how the film appears to examine masculinity without ever turning the subject into a speech. The protagonist clearly exists inside emotional patterns many men recognize but rarely verbalize openly. Suppression mistaken for strength, isolation mistaken for control, emotional avoidance slowly mutating into self-destruction, and the trailer never romanticizes it. That's crucial. There's nothing glamorous about his suffering here. He doesn't look like a tortured genius. He looks like somebody emotionally collapsing because he spent too many years refusing vulnerability until the pressure became psychologically unmanageable. That honesty gives the trailer enormous credibility, especially now when audiences are increasingly exhausted by fake, damaged male anti-heroes written to appear cool rather than painfully human. The city itself continues functioning almost like a secondary character throughout all of this. But what's remarkable is how ordinary everything feels. No futuristic dystopia, no exaggerated noir stylization, just everyday urban emptiness. Convenience stores at 2 a.m., parking garages, empty sidewalks after rain, apartment windows glowing across dark streets. That realism makes the emotional material hit harder because viewers recognize the environment instinctively. This isn't another cinematic fantasy world. It feels frighteningly close to reality. And honestly, some of the trailer's most effective tension comes from scenes where nothing overtly threatening happens at all. The protagonist simply exists inside ordinary environments while emotionally unraveling beneath the surface. There's a moment where he's brushing his teeth in silence, staring at himself in the bathroom mirror, and the scene somehow feels more tense than many action sequences in contemporary thrillers. Because the tension isn't external danger, it's internal confrontation. The possibility that he may finally recognize something about himself he can no longer emotionally survive knowing. That's deeply compelling material. The sound design reinforces this beautifully too. The trailer repeatedly amplifies small environmental sounds during psychologically intense scenes. Breathing, running water, traffic hum, electrical buzzing, floorboards creaking. Those details trap the audience inside heightened emotional awareness alongside the protagonist. When people become psychologically unstable, ordinary sensory experiences often intensify unnaturally. The film seems acutely aware of that phenomenon. And then there's the issue of redemption, or maybe the absence of redemption. The trailer dances around that question constantly without committing either way. Sometimes it hints the protagonist genuinely wants change. Other moments suggest he's simply exhausted from maintaining emotional denial. Those aren't the same thing. Wanting relief from guilt isn't automatically the same as moral transformation. The film appears intelligent enough to understand that distinction. And honestly, that's rare. A lot of movies rush damaged characters toward redemption arcs because audiences crave emotional reassurance. But real change is complicated, painful, inconsistent, sometimes incomplete, sometimes unsuccessful. The trailer preserves that ambiguity carefully. There's also something devastating about how lonely the protagonist appears, even around people who clearly care about him. Emotional isolation radiates from him constantly. Other characters attempt connection repeatedly, but he responds like somebody separated from ordinary intimacy by invisible psychological distance. That kind of loneliness feels painfully modern, especially in urban environments where people can remain socially functional while internally disconnected for years without anyone fully understanding the depth of it. One sequence near the end stood out to me because of how visually restrained it was. The protagonist walks through a crowded train station while the camera slowly pushes closer toward his face. Thousands of people move around him. Announcements echo overhead. Motion everywhere. Yet emotionally, he feels completely frozen inside himself. And then the soundtrack fades almost entirely. All we hear is breathing, not panicked breathing, exhausted breathing, like somebody trying desperately to remain emotionally intact for one more day. That image alone communicates the core emotional identity of the trailer better than any line of dialogue could. This is not a story about spectacle. It's about emotional endurance, about what prolonged guilt, repression, and self-alienation do to the human nervous system over time. The closer the trailer gets to ending, the more stripped down everything becomes. Dialogue decreases, music thins out, visual pacing slows. It's almost like the film itself is forcing the protagonist toward emotional stillness, whether he wants it or not. And that final progression feels terrifying, precisely because stillness means confrontation. No more distractions, no more motion, no more excuses, just self-recognition. There's one last shot where the protagonist closes his eyes for a brief moment, and the expression on his face isn't fear exactly. It's worse than fear. It's resignation mixed with understanding. The look of somebody realizing they can no longer outrun the emotional truth waiting underneath every distraction they built around themselves. And when the screen finally fades completely, the trailer leaves behind this lingering emotional ache rather than adrenaline. Not excitement. Ache. The uncomfortable realization that some people spend their entire lives attempting to escape external consequences, only to discover the most devastating consequence was becoming emotionally unrecognizable to themselves along the way. And that lingering ache the trailer leaves behind is probably the clearest sign that the filmmakers understood exactly what kind of story they were telling from the beginning. Because this doesn't feel like a movie interested in shocking audiences for temporary reaction. It feels like a film trying to crawl under the viewer's skin emotionally and stay there long after the credits roll. That's a completely different artistic ambition. And honestly, it's becoming increasingly rare in mainstream psychological cinema. The trailer for 180 never behaves like it's desperate for approval. That confidence changes everything. It allows scenes to breathe. It allows emotional discomfort to remain unresolved. It allows characters to exist without immediately explaining themselves to the audience, like modern films often do, out of fear people will lose patience. There's a quiet intelligence in that restraint. One of the things I found most compelling is how the protagonist gradually begins looking less like somebody hiding from the world and more like somebody hiding from recognition itself. Not public recognition, internal recognition. The kind that happens when a person finally runs out of psychological excuses and starts seeing their own patterns clearly. The trailer keeps building toward that possibility without ever spelling it out directly. And the closer it gets, the more emotionally claustrophobic everything becomes. There's a scene involving a voicemail message that lasts only a few seconds, but it completely reframed the emotional tone for me. The protagonist listens to someone speaking calmly, almost painfully calmly, while standing alone in darkness. We never hear the entire message. The trailer cuts away before completion, but whatever is being said visibly destabilizes him in a way physical danger never seems to. That detail matters, because it suggests language itself has become threatening to him. Truth has become threatening, not violence, not consequences. Truth. And that idea gives the film psychological depth far beyond standard thriller mechanics. The trailer also appears deeply interested in emotional inheritance, how unresolved damage spreads quietly between people over time. You can feel it in the strained family interactions, the exhausted conversations, the way supporting characters react like they've been emotionally adapting around the protagonist's instability for years. Nobody seems surprised anymore, just worn down. That emotional fatigue feels painfully authentic because long-term psychological deterioration rarely destroys relationships instantly. It erodes them slowly, through repetition, through disappointment, through accumulated emotional absence. The trailer captures that gradual erosion beautifully. There's one remarkable moment where another character simply says the protagonist's name during an argument, and the delivery carries more emotional history than pages of exposition could provide. Not anger, not affection, something sadder than both, familiar heartbreak, the kind that develops when somebody has disappointed you enough times that outrage eventually mutates into quiet grief instead. That's such emotionally mature writing if the full film maintains that level of nuance. And honestly, I think audiences underestimate how difficult it is to portray emotional repetition on screen realistically. Repeated betrayal, repeated avoidance, repeated self-destruction. Those cycles define many real relationships, yet films often compress them unrealistically for narrative convenience. This trailer, though, genuinely feels shaped by accumulated emotional history. Everybody looks tired in different ways. That specificity matters. The protagonist looks hollowed out internally. The female lead looks emotionally depleted from trying to reach him. Other supporting characters look angry in the exhausted way people become angry after hope starts disappearing. No emotion feels fresh. Everything feels carried. And the visual style reinforces that constantly. The lighting rarely flatters anybody conventionally. Faces appear worn down by sleeplessness, stress, regret. Even beautiful shots contain emotional heaviness. Rainwater reflecting neon signs, half-lit hallways, early morning city streets before sunrise. The world itself seems emotionally drained. I also love how the trailer refuses to transform psychological suffering into poetic fantasy. There's no romanticism here. Depression looks ugly. Isolation looks repetitive. Guilt looks exhausting. Emotional collapse looks physically draining instead of theatrically cinematic. That honesty gives the film credibility, especially in an era where so many movies aestheticize pain until it stops resembling actual human experience. There's another fascinating layer involving routine and ritual. The protagonist repeats certain behaviors throughout the trailer, almost mechanically. Driving aimlessly at night, washing his face, smoking alone, sitting in parked cars long after arriving somewhere, staring at his phone without answering calls. Those repetitive actions create the sense of somebody trapped inside emotional loops. Again, psychologically accurate. Damaged people often survive through repetition because routine creates temporary structure around internal chaos. The trailer understands that instinctively. And what's remarkable is how little explicit plot information it actually reveals while still feeling emotionally rich. We understand the protagonist's condition long before we fully understand the external circumstances creating it. That's smart storytelling because viewers emotionally invest through recognizable human behavior rather than narrative puzzle solving alone. There's also an incredible use of eye contact throughout the footage, or more specifically, avoidance of eye contact. Characters constantly look away during emotionally vulnerable moments. Conversations break visually before they break verbally. The protagonist especially seems incapable of sustaining direct emotional presence with people who matter to him. That behavioral consistency creates realism, because shame often manifests physically before people consciously acknowledge it emotionally, and the film seems deeply interested in shame, not guilt alone. Shame. The corrosive belief that damage has transformed identity itself. That distinction becomes clearer the more the trailer progresses. Guilt says, I did something terrible. Shame says, I became something terrible. The protagonist increasingly appears trapped inside the second condition. That's much harder to escape psychologically. There's one tiny moment near the end where he almost smiles during a memory fragment or imagined moment. It's difficult to tell which. And the smile disappears almost instantly, like his own nervous system rejects temporary emotional relief. That tiny detail broke my heart more than any dramatic scene in the trailer, because it suggests somebody who no longer trusts happiness emotionally, someone who believes peace would be dishonest or undeserved. That's devastating character work. The city noise during the later scenes becomes increasingly important too. Sirens, train sounds, distant shouting, car engines. It's like the world keeps moving aggressively around him while he emotionally slows down under the weight of accumulated self-recognition. And eventually the trailer almost begins feeling less like a thriller and more like a portrait of internal collapse unfolding in slow motion. Not explosive collapse, incremental collapse. The kind that happens quietly while people continue going to work, answering phones, buying groceries, pretending normalcy. That realism makes everything heavier because audiences recognize pieces of it. Maybe not the exact circumstances, but the emotional mechanisms, avoidance, isolation, compartmentalization, self-deception, the fear of becoming fully visible to yourself. Those themes resonate universally when portrayed honestly. There's also something incredibly effective about the way the trailer uses darkness, not darkness as horror aesthetics, darkness as emotional atmosphere. Scenes often begin before lights fully switch on, or continue after illumination fades. Characters exist in visual half-states constantly, not fully hidden, not fully revealed. Again, subtle but emotionally precise filmmaking. The movie seems obsessed with partial visibility, which makes perfect sense psychologically because the protagonist himself appears trapped between concealment and confession throughout the entire trailer. And by the final minutes, even the editing rhythm changes emotionally. Earlier scenes felt fragmented because the protagonist was psychologically avoiding coherence. Later scenes become longer, stiller, harder to escape from. It's almost like emotional truth itself is forcing the narrative into confrontation. That progression is incredibly smart, if intentional. And I suspect it absolutely is, because nothing in this trailer feels accidental. Every visual repetition, every silence, every unfinished sentence, every reflection, every delayed reaction, it all contributes to the same underlying emotional question. What happens when a person can no longer maintain the psychological distance necessary to survive their own self-image? That's terrifying territory for a film to explore, honestly, and the trailer seems fearless about going there. The final image especially stayed with me because it doesn't offer emotional resolution at all. The protagonist isn't redeemed. He isn't destroyed. He simply looks awake in a way he may not have been earlier in the trailer. painfully awake, aware. And maybe that's the cruelest possibility the film suggests, that true self-awareness sometimes arrives only after irreversible emotional damage has already been done. The screen cuts to black quietly after that. No final dramatic sting, no manipulative closing line, just silence. The kind of silence that feels less like an ending and more like a person sitting alone with truths they spent years trying not to hear. And honestly, the more that silence sits with you after the trailer ends, the more it starts to feel like the entire film may revolve around one brutal emotional reality most people spend their lives avoiding. Eventually, distraction stops working. That's the feeling the trailer leaves buried under all the fragmented imagery and psychological tension. Not just fear, not just regret. The terrifying moment when somebody realizes they can no longer outrun themselves emotionally, no matter how much noise they surround themselves with. And that's why the atmosphere feels so heavy. Because the protagonist in 180 doesn't seem trapped by circumstance alone. He seems trapped by accumulated self-awareness, slowly catching up to him. There's a sequence involving nighttime driving that perfectly captures this idea. We've seen countless movies use cars as symbols of freedom or escape. But here, the car feels almost like an emotional waiting room. The protagonist drives through empty streets with no visible destination, city lights flickering across his face, while the soundtrack nearly disappears completely. No dialogue, no dramatic action, just somebody moving physically while remaining psychologically motionless. That's such a painfully accurate portrayal of emotional avoidance. People often mistake movement for progress. The trailer understands the difference. And one thing I deeply respect is how patient the filmmaking appears to be with discomfort. Modern cinema frequently interrupts emotional tension before audiences have time to fully absorb it. Quick joke, sudden action beat, loud music cue, anything to avoid sustained vulnerability. This trailer does the opposite. It lingers deliberately in awkward emotional spaces. Conversations end badly and stay unresolved. Silences stretch. Characters leave things unsaid. The camera remains present long enough for discomfort to become almost physical. That confidence changes the entire emotional texture of the film. There's another remarkable detail involving the protagonist's apartment. The space itself gradually starts feeling less like a home and more like evidence of psychological deterioration. Dishes left untouched, dim lighting at odd hours, television glow filling otherwise silent rooms, curtains closed during daytime, nothing exaggerated, nothing cartoonishly depressed. Just subtle environmental signs of someone emotionally disconnecting from ordinary rhythms of living. That realism matters enormously because actual emotional collapse usually looks mundane from the outside. The trailer never loses sight of that truth, and the performances continue carrying extraordinary emotional specificity. The protagonist doesn't merely look sad or angry. His emotional state keeps shifting unpredictably between numbness, panic, self-loathing, longing, and exhaustion, sometimes within the same scene. That instability feels frighteningly human. Real psychological deterioration rarely follows clean emotional categories. People fracture inconsistently. The trailer captures that beautifully. There's one especially devastating moment where another character asks him a completely ordinary question, and you can actually see him struggle internally to respond like a normal person. Not because he lacks intelligence, because he's emotionally drowning underneath layers of unresolved internal pressure. That tiny behavioral observation tells you everything about his condition. And honestly, I think that's why the trailer works so powerfully without revealing much concrete plot. The emotional storytelling is precise enough that audiences instinctively understand the stakes even before understanding the details. The stakes are identity itself. Can somebody survive fully seeing who they became? That question hangs over every frame. There's also something deeply modern about the emotional isolation depicted here. The trailer captures a specific kind of urban loneliness where people remain constantly surrounded by activity, yet internally detached from meaningful connection. Crowded trains, busy sidewalks, restaurants filled with conversation, office buildings glowing late into the night. Yet the protagonist moves through all of it like someone emotionally invisible. That atmosphere feels painfully contemporary, especially in cities where emotional alienation often hides beneath professional functionality and social routine. The film appears acutely aware of that contradiction. Another thing I noticed is how often the protagonist physically pauses before entering spaces, doorways especially. He hesitates outside rooms constantly throughout the trailer. Apartments, offices, elevators, hospital corridors. It's subtle, but the repetition creates psychological meaning. He behaves like somebody perpetually bracing for emotional impact before crossing thresholds. That's sophisticated character work. The body remembers fear long before the conscious mind articulates it clearly, and the trailer repeatedly uses physical behavior to communicate emotional truth more effectively than dialogue ever could. There's also an incredible sadness surrounding the supporting characters because they don't seem naive about him anymore. Nobody looks shocked by his instability. They look familiar with it, adapted to it. That emotional history gives every interaction weight because you sense years of repeated disappointment underneath even ordinary conversations. One woman especially carries this heartbreaking expression throughout several scenes. Not fear exactly, not anger exactly, but the exhausted sadness of someone who once believed another person would eventually choose honesty and slowly realized they might never do it. That emotional specificity feels devastatingly real because relationships often don't collapse from one catastrophic betrayal alone. They erode through repeated emotional absence, repeated avoidance, repeated failure to fully arrive emotionally when needed. The trailer seems deeply interested in that slow erosion, and visually, the film reinforces emotional fragmentation constantly through reflections, divided framing, obscured faces, and environmental barriers. But unlike many psychological thrillers, it never feels stylistically self-conscious. The imagery serves emotional perspective rather than existing purely to look artistic. That restraint makes the atmosphere more believable. There's a brilliant scene where the protagonist stands inside a crowded subway car, surrounded by strangers, while staring at his own reflection in the train window. The reflection overlaps briefly with the passing darkness outside, making his face appear fragmented against the tunnel walls. It lasts maybe 3 seconds, but emotionally, it communicates everything. He no longer feels solid inside himself. That's the terror underneath the entire trailer. Not merely guilt, disintegration. The fear that years of emotional suppression have hollowed out identity itself. And I think the film's pacing is essential to making that fear work. Nothing feels rushed emotionally. The trailer understands that psychological collapse often unfolds gradually, almost invisibly at first. Small behavioral shifts accumulate until eventually a person becomes emotionally unrecognizable, even to themselves. That gradualism creates authenticity. Hollywood usually dramatizes breakdown too aggressively. Sudden explosions, public meltdowns, cinematic screaming. Real emotional deterioration often looks quieter than that. more repetitive, more exhausting. The trailer seems deeply committed to portraying that reality honestly. There's another sequence involving morning light entering the apartment that stayed with me because of how emotionally empty it feels. The protagonist sits awake long after sunrise, untouched coffee beside him, television static flickering softly in the background. No music, barely any movement, just somebody unable to reconnect with ordinary life. That stillness feels heavier than violence. And maybe that's why the trailer lingers psychologically after it ends. It understands that emotional paralysis can be more frightening than external danger, because paralysis traps people inside themselves. The soundtrack deserves enormous credit here too. Music appears sparingly, almost reluctantly. Often the emotional tension comes entirely from environmental sound and silence, air conditioning hum, distant sirens, elevator motors, passing trains. Those ordinary sounds become emotionally oppressive because the protagonist seems hypersensitive to stillness. Like his nervous system can no longer relax naturally. Again, deeply believable psychological detail. There's also something tragic about how desperately he appears to want connection, despite continually sabotaging it. Certain scenes hint that part of him still hopes for forgiveness or understanding, yet whenever vulnerability becomes possible, he retreats instinctively into avoidance or aggression. That contradiction feels painfully human. Damaged people often crave intimacy while simultaneously fearing it because intimacy threatens exposure. The trailer captures that emotional contradiction beautifully, and by the final stretch, the film almost stops feeling narrative-driven entirely. It becomes experiential, emotional. Like the audience is slowly being immersed inside the protagonist's psychological exhaustion, rather than simply observing it externally. That's sophisticated filmmaking when done correctly. Because viewers stop analyzing plot mechanics and start feeling emotional pressure directly. The trailer accomplishes that without ever becoming pretentious or abstract beyond comprehension. Everything remains grounded in recognizable human behavior. Even the title keeps evolving emotionally the longer you think about it. 180 initially sounds like transformation, change, reversal. But by the end of the trailer, the title starts feeling more tragic than hopeful, because turning around emotionally doesn't erase distance already traveled. Some consequences continue forward regardless. The protagonist increasingly appears aware of that reality, and that awareness seems to be destroying him internally. The final images become almost unbearably intimate because the film strips away distractions one by one until only the character's emotional condition remains. No spectacle, no mystery box teasing. Just a person confronting the unbearable possibility that they spent years constructing a version of themselves capable of survival, while slowly losing the ability to recognize the original person underneath it. That idea hits hard because it feels universal beneath the thriller framework. Everyone understands some version of self-avoidance. Everyone understands emotional compartmentalization. Everyone understands the fear of seeing themselves too clearly. The trailer taps into those anxieties without simplifying them. And when the screen finally cuts to black, the silence afterward feels intentional in the deepest possible way. Not empty silence, consequential silence. The kind that forces audiences to sit momentarily with their own thoughts instead of immediately escaping into noise again.